All right, joining us to unpack the UN summit is Dr. Dale McKinley, Research and Education Officer at International Labour Research and Information Group. Good afternoon, Doctor. Thank you very much for joining us on the program. A very assertive President Cyril Ramaphosa yesterday emphasizing the need for the recognition of two states, both Israel and Palestine, existing side by side peacefully, but also going on to condemn the Hamas 7th October attack, however stating that Israel's response to that attack has been disproportionate. Your views on just his address?
Yeah, thanks, Fundo, for having me. I think, first of all, that this is consistent with South Africa's position from the very beginning of taking the case to the ICJ. South Africa staked out a position internationally in support of Palestinian, not only statehood, but obviously against the ongoing genocide and attack on Gaza. And I think it's what the president said was consistent with that. I think it's also a defense of, the kind of politics that in many cases from the global south against what the Trumps and many of the other sort of right-wing politicians in Europe are basically who have supported completely unconditionally the Israeli government and what has been happening there. And it's a pushback in some ways, in not ways a polite one, you could say, but one that's quite firm. And I think in many cases it's a reminder that you can't have it both ways. On one hand, you can't talk about national sovereignty and the ability to be able to make decisions, and then you violate that sovereignty and that national, privileges on the basis of attacking the sovereignties of other countries. So I think there was it was a good way of saying things in a way that didn't maybe isolate a lot of people, but also made the points that needed to be made both politically and I think morally as well.
But symbolically, for France as an ally, to co-chair that summit. I mean, listening to President Emmanuel Macron, he received a standing ovation with just his address saying nothing at this point justifies the ongoing war. Actually, everything compels all nations to end it now. Does that not mean we're seeing an Israel that could possibly now be isolated, given what we saw yesterday? Dr. Dale, I don't know if you're struggling there to hear me.
Sorry, no, Fundo. I think we're having some...
I can repeat my question.
Yes, I was struggling to hear you. Could you just sort of repeat the last part of the question, please?
Yes, I'm just saying that is Israel not becoming just more and more isolated now globally, given what we saw yesterday? I mean, symbolically, what happened yesterday was we had an ally in the form of France co-chairing that summit and saying that nothing today justifies that ongoing war, but everything compels all nations to end it now. Symbolically, does that not say that Israel is becoming more isolated? All right. Unfortunately,
sure, I think it definitely does. I think what you're seeing, even though I don't...
You can continue, Doctor.
Sorry, can you hear me now? I'm sorry.
I can hear you now, Doctor. You can continue.
Okay, I was saying, yes, you're absolutely correct that it does basically show that Israel is becoming further isolated. Although I think that some of the measures that the French and others have taken in recognizing Palestinian statehood are fairly perfunctory. We need to see real support. We need to see the fact that the weapons need to be stopped. The trade needs to be basically stopped to Israel in the context of putting much more pressure on them, because these kinds of moves, while they are welcome politically, I think practically they don't have much of an impact on Israel. Israel's basically, and the Netanyahu government has doubled down on this. And as long as they have the support of the Trump administration, I think they'll feel as though they can do pretty much whatever they want. So I think countries need to put their monies where their mouth are, as opposed to just making statements.
Speaking on Donald Trump, his address became quite the talking point. No surprises, of course. I mean, he went on to criticize, pardon me, beyond even just starting on with what seemed like a domestic address. It felt like some sort of a State of the Nation address where he spoke about all his successes as the United States, how the economy is booming, but then went on to criticize the UN for being ineffective, saying, among others, that in He ended 7 wars in 7 months without the assistance of the UN. But interestingly, what many are saying now is that he didn't touch on the veto powers that the permanent 5 nations exercise at any given point to shield those in conflict that they align with. What did you make of just that statement, criticizing the UN without actually pointing a finger that they enable war to actually continue?
Yeah, well, I think, and I've said this, and I think several other commentators have mentioned this, which is Trump is a self-serving, egotistical politician. He does not really care about anything other than himself and his crew, and we must understand this. So he comes to the United Nations and has the temerity to basically claim that he's ended 7 wars, all of which, of course, are false. He has not ended any of those wars. And we can talk about the Congo, Rwanda war, we can talk about Ethiopia, Egypt, we can talk about all of these wars, none of which have ended in particular, and certainly not because of Trump. And then, of course, to attack the UN. This is consistent with the Trump and the MAGA agenda, which is to delegitimize multilateral institutions, which is to basically try to stride the world on a basis of American power and basically making everyone else bend the knee and do what they would like them to do. So it was, I think, despicable. It was actually something that was unacceptable. It is indicative of a politics that is the vast majority of the rest of the world rejects. And it's also indicative of how out of touch Donald Trump is with the rest of the world and how he's moving down a particular path that I think is quite destructive, not only for the world, but also for the United States in the long term.
Because as the figure stands, as of 18 September 2025, America has used its veto powers 89 times. 51 of those times it was to protect Israel. So one wonders who is actually keeping these conflicts going. But then in true Trump style, he also spoke on immigration, saying that in instances where the UN should solve problems, according to him, they go on to create problems such as the immigration crisis across the globe. And he went on to say all countries are going to hell because they've got illegal aliens entering their countries. He spoke of London and how the mayor is a silly man because you've got Muslims running around in London where they're now trying to bring Sharia law. What did you make of just that? And even the inability to perhaps use a lot of euphemism when articulating himself as a statesman, where he goes on to just say, your countries are going to hell.
Yeah, no, it's hard to know how to respond to what Trump says because essentially everything, as I said, is either misinformation, self-referential, it does not speak to the realities of what are going on. So in relation, for example, to the role of the United Nations, of course, we all know that there are criticisms of the United Nations, but the United Nations has played a very fundamental role in trying to solve some of the problems and trying to create humanitarian corridors, in basically trying to organize for humanitarian support in areas which are greatly needed. Also on the climate change issue, which Trump, of course, doubled down on and basically dismissed as a hoax.
Yeah.
This is part of a right-wing MAGA agenda, which is something that I think the world is coming to be exposed to, that it makes no logical sense what he says. It doesn't relate to the realities of the situation. And yeah, so I think in many cases, you cannot answer that diplomatically and politically on a logical basis. You simply have to reject what he's saying and move in a different direction. I think that's what our president in some ways was attempting to do, was to try to lead in that different direction.
But then on the reforms of these multilateral institutions, as you say, a number of other bodies have criticized the lack of transformation, so many years on, because even President Cyril Ramaphosa went on to state that it needs to be looked at. If we're talking about the P5 or the permanent 5 nations that have these veto powers, they get to decide as the Security Council on issues that impact other nations and their own security. Surely it should be time now that there is some sort of reform when it comes to that at the very least.
Absolutely. I think there's no question that the United Nations, despite some of the good things that it has done, has served the big powers. And established in the post-World War II era when those 5 were given the vetoes. And basically, as you said, the United States has used it many, many times. China, Russia have also used it in many cases. So there is a need for reform. But what this opens up a debate about is not about whether or not we should do away with the United Nations. Not heard, need to do more to basically create avenues for themselves. New trade, new diplomatic relations, new power centers in our region and our continent that don't rely solely on the United Nations, but begin to create counter power centers to the big ones. And I think that's where we are heading as a world. When we talk about multilateralism, we're not necessarily talking about the United Nations per se, but about other countries beginning to take their rightful place economically, politically, and otherwise in the world affairs. And it's not going to be the United Nations that's going to do that for them. It's going to be themselves in their own collectives.
Among them, of course, being BRICS. Doctor, thank you very much for your insights this afternoon. That's Dr. Gail McKinley, Research and Education Officer at the International Labour Research and Information Group, speaking to us there.